The Wyoming sun of 1883 was a hard, unforgiving thing. On a Sunday morning in Thistle Ridge, it beat down on the pitched roof of the First Baptist Church, baking the pine boards until they bled the scent of resin into the dry air. Inside, the heat was thick with the smell of sweat, wool, and cheap perfume. Every pew was packed, the bodies crammed shoulder to shoulder, not for worship, but for a spectacle. This wasn't a congregation, it was an audience, and they had come for the final act of a long-running play of social cruelty. They had come to see the deaf girl marry the banker's son. When the heavy oak doors opened, a collective rustle went through the crowd. Necks craned. Ada Lark stood silhouetted against the blinding light of the street. She paused on the threshold, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dim interior. A world painted in bruised purples and blood reds by the stained glass windows. She was a slight figure, made smaller by the cavernous space. Her dress was simple, sewn from mail-order muslin, but on it lay the only piece of jewelry she owned, a necklace fashioned from her mother's silver buttons, each one intricately carved with the likeness of a prairie primrose. They felt cool and heavy against the frantic pulse in her throat. Her hands, hidden in delicate lace gloves that had also been her mother's, trembled not with joy, but with a taut, bone-deep anxiety. She began her walk down the aisle. Her world was one of silence, a vast, unbroken canvas upon which she painted meaning from movement and light. She felt the vibrations of shuffling feet through the thin soles of her shoes. She saw the light glinting off a man's spectacles, the nervous flutter of a woman's fan, the sly grin shared between two matrons in the front pew. The light from the windows sliced across the pews like colored knives, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and, with them, the expressions on the faces of the townspeople. Ada had learned to read lips as a starving man learns to find water. It was a skill born of necessity, imperfect but vital. Now, as she moved through the sea of watchers, she caught fragments, a woman's mouth forming the words, "Pity, isn't it?" A man's lips twisting around the shape of Sloane's money. She saw smirks that were hastily covered by hymnals. She saw the cold, appraising glances that measured her worth and found it wanting. They were not whispering so much as tasting the gossip on their tongues, savoring it before swallowing. Ada kept her chin high, her gaze fixed on the altar, pretending she saw nothing, felt nothing. It was a performance she had perfected over a lifetime. There, waiting for her, stood Merritt Cole. He was the son of Abner Sloane, the man who owned the bank, the general store, and very nearly the soul of Thistle Ridge. Merritt was a reflection of his father's wealth, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit of dark wool, his hair slicked with Macassar oil, his boots polished to a mirror shine, but where his father's eyes held a shrewd cunning, Merritt's held only a flat, chilling emptiness. They were the color of steel, and just as cold. He did not smile as she approached. He simply stood, a statue of prosperous indifference, his posture rigid with impatience. He looked at her not as a bride, but as the final clause in a business transaction. Ada reached the altar and took her place beside him. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, yet there was no warmth in it. Reverend Miller, a man whose face was a roadmap of weary kindness, cleared his throat and began the ceremony. Ada watched his lips, following the familiar, comforting rhythm of the rites. The words were a silent song she knew by heart. She offered the responses at the correct moments, her voice soft and unused, a ghost in the silent cathedral of her mind. The moment came. The church grew still, the air tightening with anticipation. This was it. This was the part of the show they had all paid their silent admission to see. Reverend Miller turned to Merritt. His lips formed the timeless question, "Do you, Merritt Cole, take this woman, Ada Lark, to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health?" Merritt let the question hang in the air, a baited hook. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion that was an act of pure theater, he turned his head away from Ada. He faced the congregation, a small, cruel smile playing on his lips. He spoke. Ada saw his mouth move. She saw the shape of the words, the smug satisfaction in his eyes as he uttered them. She could not hear the sound, the precise timbre of the insult, but she saw its effect. A gasp rippled through the front pews, followed by a sudden, ugly burst of snickering from the back. A few people, bolder and crueler than the rest, laughed outright. The sound was a vibration she felt in her teeth. It was a physical blow. The meaning crashed down on her, not as words, but as a wave of pure, undiluted humiliation. The faces in the crowd swam before her eyes, their expressions a grotesque mixture of pity and amusement. Merritt was still looking at them, at his audience, soaking in their reaction. He had not spoken to the preacher. He had not spoken to her. He had spoken to the town, and in one sharp, public gesture, he had cast her aside. The small bouquet of dried wildflowers she was clutching slipped from her gloved fingers. It hit the wooden floor with a soft, final thud she did not hear but saw. The lavender and yarrow blossoms scattered like fallen hopes. A profound and desolate sorrow washed over her, a grief for a dignity she never truly had but had just been stolen anyway. She stood frozen, a bride abandoned at the altar of public opinion, the silent object of a joke she couldn't even hear. At that exact moment, a gust of hot prairie wind pushed open the church doors at the far end of the aisle, making them groan on their hinges. A figure stood there, framed by the harsh afternoon light. He was tall and broad, leaning one shoulder against the doorframe as if he'd been there for some time, watching. He wore a canvas duster, gray with the dust of a long trail, and a flat-brimmed hat pulled low, shadowing his face. All that could be seen clearly were his eyes, and they were the color of the sky just before a thunderstorm. He pushed himself off the doorframe and began to walk up the aisle. He did not walk with the hesitant shuffle of a churchgoer. His steps were long and measured, the heels of his worn boots making a solid, rhythmic sound on the floorboards, a sound Ada felt as a steady, grounding pulse through the soles of her shoes. The congregation parted before him like a wheat field in a breeze. He didn't remove his hat. He didn't ask for permission. His focus was singular, aimed directly at the tableau of cruelty at the altar. He was Jonah Pike, a widower, the man who owned Red Willow Ranch, a sprawling piece of land out where the plains met the foothills, a place folks said was too wild, too remote. He was a man who kept to himself, whose presence in town was rare and always brief. To see him here, in the middle of this social execution, was as shocking as seeing a wolf wander into the general store. He stopped directly in front of Ada. He ignored the sputtering reverend. He ignored Merritt Cole, who stared at him with a mixture of outrage and disbelief. Jonah Pike looked only at Ada. He saw the single, silent tear that traced a path through the faint dust on her cheek. He saw the shattered look in her eyes. He didn't say a word. He simply reached out and took her arm. His touch gentle but firm. He helped her straighten up, lending her his strength. Then, he bent down and picked up one of the fallen sprigs of yarrow, placing it carefully in her trembling hand. He took her other hand in his. His was large and calloused, the skin rough from reins and rope and hard labor, but it enveloped hers with a warmth that felt like an anchor. It was a hand as solid and dependable as the trunk of an old pine. With Ada's hand still in his, Jonah Pike turned to face the stunned congregation. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not loud, but it carried the weight of the mountains. It was deep and resonant, like rocks grinding together. "She's worth more than any of you." The words dropped into the silence, and the snickering died instantly. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Merritt's face went from smug to purple with rage. His father, Abner Sloan, rose halfway from his seat in the front pew, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. Ada, of course, heard none of it. She was watching Jonah's face. She couldn't read his lips from this angle, but she didn't need to. She saw the unwavering conviction in his storm-gray eyes. She saw the hard line of his jaw, the protective set of his shoulders. She saw a certainty there, that she had never seen on any other face in her entire life. Then, he did something extraordinary. He looked down at her, his gaze softening, slowly, deliberately. He raised his free hand. He touched his index finger to the center of his chest, over his heart. Then, he extended that same finger and pointed it directly at her. It was not a language of the hands that she had been taught. It was a sign of his own making, born of the moment, but its meaning was as clear as the Wyoming sky. A choice, a declaration, a vow made in silence, for a woman who lived in silence. Reverend Miller stood gaping, his prayer book held limply in his hand. He looked from Merritt's apoplectic face to Jonah Pike's granite resolve, and then to the young woman standing between them. He saw the dawning light of hope in Ada's eyes. He was a man of God, but he was also a man of the frontier, and he knew courage when he saw it. He knew injustice, too. Taking a deep, shaky breath, he made a decision. His voice wavered only slightly as he looked past Merritt and addressed the dusty rancher holding the bride's hand. "Son," he said, his voice regaining a sliver of its pastoral authority, "what is your name?" "Jonah Pike." The Reverend nodded, a faint, weary smile touching his lips. He cleared his throat and turned a page in his book, his eyes finding the place he had just left. The wedding, it seemed, was not over. It had just found a different groom, and so, in a single, surreal breath, under the judgmental eyes of the entire town of Thistle Ridge, the ceremony continued. The high plateau wind met them as they exited the church. It was not a gentle breeze, but a steady scouring force that smelled of dust and the sharp, herbal scent of sagebrush. It whipped the thin muslin of Ada's wedding dress against her legs and tugged at the pins in her hair, pulling strands loose to frame her face. The congregation had spilled out behind them, a silent, staring mass, held at bay by the sheer, unblinking authority of the man at her side. Jonah Pike did not look back. He kept his large, warm hand on her elbow, a grounding pressure that was neither possessive nor rough, but simply there. It was a guide, not a chain. He led her to a solid, dun-colored gelding tethered to the hitching post. He didn't speak, didn't offer apologies or explanations. He simply moved with a quiet economy of motion. He put his hands together, lacing his fingers to form a stirrup, and gestured to her foot. Ada understood. She placed her thin shoe into his grasp, and with an ease that belied her weightlessness, he lifted her onto the saddle. He didn't swing her up by the waist or make a show of it. His strength was functional, respectful. He placed the reins in her hands, his fingers brushing hers for only a second, and then turned to mount his own horse, a powerful roan that watched the lingering crowd with wary eyes. They rode out of Thistle Ridge. No one followed. No one called out. Ada could feel the vibration of two sets of hooves beneath her, a steady, rhythmic thud, 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 thud that settled into her bones. It was a new pulse, one that drowned out the frantic, frightened hammering of her own heart. Jonah rode beside her, a broad shield of canvas and muscle, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his hat pulled low. He set a pace that was steady, not rushed, allowing her to acclimate to the saddle and the strange, suspended reality of the moment. She had entered that church to be humiliated, to be the final punctuation on a cruel joke. She was leaving it as, what, a wife, a rescued stray. She didn't know. She only knew the solid presence of the man beside her and the vast, silent emptiness of the Wyoming territory opening up before them. The journey to Red Willow Ranch took them out of the shallow valley and up onto the high plains, where the grass was the color of old straw and the sky was a painful, aching blue. The wind was a constant companion, a physical weight she felt against her face. She couldn't hear its howl, but she saw it in the frantic bowing of the grasslands, the ripple of the mane on Jonah's horse, the way his duster billowed out behind him like a dark wing. They reached the crossing at Dry Lantern Creek. The wooden bridge rumbled beneath the horse's hooves, the vibration changing from the solid earth to a hollow, resonant drumming. Ada looked down. The creek was slow-moving and muddy, the color of weak coffee. In the murky water, she saw their reflection, two figures, wavering and indistinct, joined by the shape of the horses they rode. The image shimmered, broke apart, and came back together, a prophecy of a future she could not begin to guess. She looked away, her hands tightening on the leather reins. Red Willow Ranch was not a home so much as a fortress against the elements. It sat in a shallow dip, sheltered by a stand of aging cottonwoods and 3 tall, eponymous willows that glowed a faint crimson in the afternoon light. The house itself was long and low, built of thick pine logs chinked with pale mud, its roof pitched to shed the heavy snows. A wide porch, deep and shaded, wrapped around the front. It was a house built for endurance, not for beauty. It was quiet. Ada felt the stillness of the place as soon as they entered the yard. There were no voices, no laughter, no barking dogs, just the thump of the horses' hooves on the packed earth and the creak of the wind in the branches. Jonah dismounted and came to her side. He didn't offer his hand this time, just stood near, letting her find her own way down. She slid from the saddle, her legs unsteady. He caught her elbow to steady her, then released her immediately, as if he understood her desperate need for balance, for her own ground. He led her onto the porch. The front door opened into a large main room that smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and old leather. It was Spartan, meticulously clean. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean, though a bed of gray ash spoke of a recent fire, a lingering, ambient warmth that softened the air. Against the far wall stood a heavy oak writing desk, covered not with letters, but with ledgers and what looked like maps of the land. And next to it, hanging on the wall, was a large, framed slate board, a stick of white chalk resting in a groove at its base. Jonah walked past her, his spurs making a soft, jingling sound she couldn't hear, but felt as a flicker in her peripheral vision. He went directly to the slate. He picked up the chalk. Ada watched, transfixed, as the white dust scratched against the black surface. His handwriting was like his presence, strong, clear, and devoid of unnecessary flourishes. Safe here. Rest. He tapped the slate twice, a signal for her to read. She stepped closer, her eyes tracing the letters. Safe. The word felt foreign. He then turned to her and, in a gesture that was both clumsy and profoundly articulate, he crossed his forearms over his chest, his hands clasping his shoulders in a pantomime of holding something secure. It wasn't a formal sign, but its meaning was unmistakable, protected, secure. Ada reached out a trembling finger, not to the words, but to the chalk dust left behind. She touched the gritty white powder on the final letter of rest. It felt real. It was tangible. In her silent world, this was the first voice that had not been an instrument of mockery or pity. It was a simple statement of fact, written in stone. The enormity of the day, the humiliation, the fear, the sudden, shocking rescue, this strange, quiet man, this alien safety, it all crashed down on her. Tears welled, hot and stinging, but she refused to let them fall. She turned back to the slate, picked up the chalk herself. Her own hand was shaking, her script a frantic, sloping contrast to his. You didn't have to. She didn't wait for his reply. She didn't know what to do with his kindness. It felt more dangerous than Merritt's cruelty. She fled, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She felt the vibration of her own pulse, a terrifying, internal roar. She hurried into the small room he had indicated with a nod, a simple guest room with a narrow cot, a clean quilt, and a single window looking out onto the endless, empty plains. She shut the door, leaned against the solid wood, and finally let the silence of her tears come. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Morning light, pale and clear, streamed through the small window. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the memory of the church, of Merritt's sneer and Jonah's sudden appearance, returned. She was at Red Willow Ranch. She was impossibly, married. She rose slowly, wrapping the thick quilt around her shoulders against the morning chill. The house was silent, but it was a living silence. She could feel the low-level vibration of movement from the main room. She opened her door. Jonah was not there. A tin mug of coffee, black and steaming, sat on the table near the hearth. The fire had been built up, casting a warm, flickering light. Her eyes went immediately to the slate. Her words, "You didn't have to," were still there, but beneath them, Jonah had replied. It wasn't just words. First, there was a drawing, a simple, careful sketch of a human ear, and through the middle of it, he had drawn a fine, jagged line, like a crack in porcelain or a tiny bolt of lightning. It was not a drawing of mockery, it was one of observation. Beneath the sketch, he had written 4 words. "You hear differently." Ada stared at the message. He hadn't written, "You can't hear." He hadn't used the town's cruel words, dumb, broken, mute. He had not defined her by her lack, but by her difference. You hear differently. It was an acknowledgement, a validation of her entire existence, more profound than any sermon she had ever read on Reverend Miller's lips. The tears that had been born of humiliation in the church and fear in this new house now returned, but they were different. This was a cry of relief, a quiet, shuddering release of a pain she had carried for so long she had mistaken it for part of her own spine. She didn't make a sound, but her shoulders shook. The bloodless wounds of a lifetime of isolation felt, for the first time, as if they were being seen. "Ma'am." The vibration of his voice made her turn. Jonah Pike stood in the open doorway, his hat in his hands. He was backlit by the bright morning sun, a dark, solid shape. He saw her tears, but he did not rush forward to comfort her. He didn't pat her shoulder or offer a handkerchief. He simply stood there, waiting, allowing her the dignity of her grief. Slowly, he walked into the room. He placed a second mug of coffee on the desk. He didn't sit in the chair opposite her, which would have felt like a confrontation. Instead, he moved to the fireplace and sat on the raised stone hearth, a few feet away. He was not crowding her. He was simply sharing the space. He sat there for a long moment, staring into the flames. Then, he looked at her. He didn't smile. He just watched her, his storm-gray eyes unreadable but steady. Finally, he extended his large, rough hand, holding it out in the space between them. It was not a command. It was not a gesture of pity. It was palm up, an offer, a question. Ada looked at his hand. She saw the scars across his knuckles, the ingrained dirt in the lines of his palm, the strength in the set of his fingers. This was the hand that had lifted her onto the horse, the hand that had written the words that had undone her. Slowly, wiping the dampness from her cheek with her sleeve, she reached out. She placed her small, pale hand into his. His fingers closed around hers. The contact was electric, the contrast of her smooth skin against his calloused, sun-baked warmth. He gave her hand a single, firm squeeze. It was a pact, an unspoken agreement, a promise of something she couldn't yet name. She didn't pull away. He didn't let go. They sat there in the quiet room as the fire crackled. 2 strangers bound by a public spectacle, now forging a private, silent truce. That evening, the rhythm of this new life began. Jonah moved with a purpose that was hypnotic to watch. He built up the fire as the temperature dropped, the thud of the logs a steady beat. He cooked a simple meal of beans and skillet bread, placing a plate in front of her without ceremony. Later, as the shadows grew long and the room was lit only by the dancing flames, he boiled water. He handed her a hot tin mug of strong herbal tea. He looked at her, then gave a short, simple nod. It was a gesture of finality, a good night. Ada took the mug, her fingers wrapping around the heat. She watched him bank the fire for the night. The wounds from merit, the stinging humiliation, the years of being seen as a burden, they were not gone. But here, in the firelight, in this fortress of silence, they had stopped bleeding. The simple gestures of the day, the coffee, the offered hand, the shared meal, the hot tea were a balm, the first careful bandages on wounds no one else had ever bothered to see. The silence of Red Willow Ranch was a living thing. It had its own textures, its own rhythms. In the first few days, the silence between Ada and Jonah was taut. A thin wire stretched between 2 points of profound uncertainty. They moved around each other with the careful, deliberate grace of strangers sharing a small boat. The slate board became their sole bridge, a place for functional, necessary exchanges. Need firewood. Coffee is hot. Mending basket. On the 5th day, Jonah rode into Thistle Ridge. Ada watched him go from the porch, a knot of old fear tightening in her stomach. The town was a place of staring eyes and cruel mouths. His return, hours later, was not something she heard, but something she felt, a change in the pressure of the air. A vibration in the porch floorboards that announced his horses long before they appeared. He dismounted, not heading for the barn as usual, but walking directly to her. He carried a small, rectangular package wrapped in brown paper and string. He held it out to her. His face was unreadable, masked by trail dust and the shadow of his hat. She took it. The object inside was heavy, solid. She fumbled with the string, her fingers clumsy. Inside the paper was a book. It was not new. The blue cloth cover was faded to the color of a weak sky. The corners softened and frayed. The gold lettering on the spine was so worn it was almost invisible, but she could just make it out, the manual alphabet for beginners. Ada looked up at him, her eyes wide. He had faced the town, gone into a store, and purchased this. For her, for them. He had not abandoned her to the functional silence of the slate. He intended to learn. He nodded once, a short, sharp gesture that said, "Well, open it." That evening, by the light of the fire, the first lesson began. The main room of the ranch house became a classroom. Ada sat in her chair, the book open on her lap, and Jonah sat opposite her on a low stool, leaning forward, his forearms resting on his knees. She was the teacher now, a role she had never held, and he was the student, a man clearly unaccustomed to being one. She started simply. She held up her hand, shaping the letter A, a closed fist, the thumb held straight up the side. She pointed to the diagram in the book, then to her hand. Jonah watched her, his expression serious, almost grim. He mirrored the sign. His hand was enormous, the knuckles scarred, the skin weathered. His attempt looked less like a letter and more like a threat. Ada smiled, a small, involuntary twitch of her lips. She shook her head gently and, with a hesitation that was almost painful, she reached out. She touched his hand, her cool, small fingers repositioning his thumb. He flinched, not at her, but at the strangeness of the contact, the sheer delicacy of her touch against his rough skin. But he allowed it. She molded his hand into the correct shape. She released him, and he held the sign, staring at it as if it were a foreign object he was learning to tame. She formed a B, fingers straight, thumb tucked across her palm. He copied it. C, a curve of fingers and thumb. He got that one easily. Then D, the index finger pointing straight up. The other fingers and thumb curled into a circle. He fumbled, his large fingers tangling. He grunted in frustration. A low sound she felt more than heard, and shook his hand out, as if to rid it of its own clumsiness. She waited. He took a breath, looked at her steady, patient gaze, and tried again. D. This time, he held it. She smiled, a real smile of encouragement. Then, slowly, she signed the 3 letters she had practiced in her mind. A, D, A. He watched her. His gray eyes, usually so distant, were intensely focused. He followed the movement of her fingers. He saw the sequence. A, D, A. A look of dawning comprehension crossed his face. He lifted his own hand and slowly, clumsily, he spelled it back to her. A, D, A. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. Is this right? Ada's breath caught. It was the first time in her life anyone had ever spoken her name to her in a way she could see. It was not a sound, a vibration she might feel, a shape of lips she had to decipher. It was a word, whole and clear, formed by his hand. She nodded, her eyes suddenly burning. A slow smile spread across Jonah Pike's face. It was a startling transformation. It was not the tight, closed-mouth expression of politeness. It was a genuine, unguarded smile of pure, boyish accomplishment. It lit his eyes and softened the hard lines of his face, making him look, for a moment, like a different man. He had learned his first word, her name. They fell into a new rhythm. The slate was for complex thoughts, for things that required the precision of written language. The gestures, the signs, were for the flow of the day. But language, even a new one, was fraught with frustration. Ada, excited by his willingness, would often sign too quickly, her hands a blur of movement, her stories and questions tumbling out. Jonah would be left behind, his brow furrowed, shaking his head in defeat. One evening, after she had tried to explain a complicated recipe for preserves 3 times, he reached across the table and, with a gentleness that bell-sighed his frustration, placed his hand over hers, stilling them. He didn't write on the slate. He just tapped the back of her hand. Once, twice, slow down. Ada stopped. She looked at his hand covering hers. It was a new signal, a new rule. She nodded in understanding. He removed his hand, and she began again, spelling each word with exaggerated, patient care. From then on, the light tap on the back of the hand became their signal. It meant, again. It meant, I don't understand. It meant, slow down. I am here. I am trying. It was the first part of their language that was based not on a book, but on touch. The safer she felt, the more the past tried to intrude. She found herself watching him, this quiet, solid man who had asked for nothing, not even her story. One night, as a cold wind moaned around the corners of the house, she felt a sudden, sharp need for him to know, not the shame of the wedding, but the origin of the fear he had seen in her eyes. She sat on the hearth, he in his chair. She got his attention with a small wave. He looked up from the ledger he was studying. She began, using the halting signs he knew, gestures, and pantomime. She painted a picture, a little girl. She pointed to herself. She mimed small. Then she cupped her hand to her ear and shook her head. No sound. She pantomimed her father, a large, angry shape. She signed, he angry. Then she mimed dropping a dish, the gesture for broke. She showed him the punishment. Her father grabbing her arm, dragging her, she pointed outside, to the barn. She signed horse house. She mimed him pushing her in, the door shutting, the world going black. Dark, cold, she hugged her arms to her chest, shivering in the memory. She signed, he said, you not listen. She then pointed to her ear again, her face a mask of old, remembered injustice. I, not, here. Jonah's face had gone perfectly still as he watched her silent play. The only movement was the tightening of his jaw, a muscle bunching in his cheek. He wasn't looking at her with the wet shine of pity she so despised. He was looking at her with a cold, still anger that was not directed at her, but for her. He saw the child locked in the dark, punished for a crime she was incapable of committing. When she was finished, her hands trembling in her lap, he did not reach for her. He did not offer empty comfort. He simply nodded, acknowledging the weight of the story she had given him. He stood, walked to his desk, and dipped his pen in the inkwell. He wrote, not on the slate for her, but in his thick, leather-bound ledger, the book where he kept the accounts of the ranch. He wrote one sharp, angry line. Ada, watching him, felt a strange sense of release. Later, after he was outside, she went to the desk. She looked at the open page, reading his script upside down. Don't need ears to know what's right. The ranch became their world. They spoke with their eyes, with their hands, with the spaces they left for each other. In the evenings, they practiced this new language. Jonah would watch her face in the firelight, learning the way a small furrow between her brows meant she was worried, or the way her eyes lit up before she even formed the sign for a question. She learned to read his stillness, to know that when he stared into the fire, his shoulders set, he was not angry, but thinking, deep in the land of his ledgers and his past. In the mornings, she learned to listen with her body. She knew his routine better than he did. She felt the vibration of his boots on the porch floor, a solid thud-thud that meant he was headed for the barn. She felt the rhythmic shh of the floorboards as he used the broom to sweep the hearth. She learned the exact moment to pour his coffee, knowing by the scrape of his chair that he was sitting down to the table. Her greatest test was his return. She couldn't hear the horses, but the old wood of the porch was a drum. She would stand there in the late afternoon, her bare feet pressed to the boards, feeling for the distant, faint thump-thump of hooves. At first, every passing wagon on the far-off trail made her heart leap, but she learned his rhythm. She learned the gait of his roan, a heavier, steadier beat than the frantic rattling of a buckboard. She would have a dipper of cool water waiting for him as he rode in, and the quiet surprise in his eyes was her reward. He, in turn, learned to read her. He watched her hands move, not just when she was signing, but when she was kneading dough, mending a shirt, or simply resting them on the table. He learned to anticipate her. She would start to sign. "Did you?" And he would already be nodding, getting up to fetch the heavier sack of flour she needed. He began to understand her thoughts before her fingers had even finished the words. Their dinners were rituals of peace, the simple meals cornbread, a rabbit stew, beans flavored with salt pork, tasted richer in this shared quiet. The pine table was no longer a barrier. The chair opposite him was no longer empty. It was filled by her presence, by the soft light of the lamp on her hair, by the quick, expressive movements of her hands as she told him about her day, a hawk she saw, a patch of wild thyme she'd found. One afternoon, she came in from a walk, her hands full of wild sage. She placed a sprig of it in a crack in the wooden window frame above the dry sink. It was a small act of domesticity, a claim on the space. It was her sign to him, to the house. "I am okay. I am finding my place." Jonah saw it that evening. He didn't speak of it, but he went to the window, touched one of the gray-green leaves, and inhaled its sharp, clean scent. The next day, he spent the entire afternoon working outside that same window. Ada watched him, curious. He was measuring, sawing, and hammering. By dusk, he had built and hung a new, perfectly fitted storm shutter for her window. It was heavy, solid, and strong. He hadn't used the slate. He hadn't used a sign. The shutter was his answer. "I am here. I will keep you safe." The first laugh came, as it often does, unexpectedly. Jonah was trying to mend a torn leather bridle, his large, calloused fingers fumbling with the tiny, sharp awl and thin waxed thread. He was frowning, his brow furrowed in concentration. His tongue stuck out the corner of his mouth just slightly. He was a man who could tame a wild horse or build a house, but this delicate work was his undoing. Ada watched him, a smile playing on her lips. He cursed silently, shaking his hand after poking his finger for the third time. She stepped closer. He looked up, his frustration plain. She signed, very slowly, a small, mischievous light in her eyes. "My grandmother sewed faster, and she was blind. In one eye." He stared at her hands. He processed the words. His face remained blank for a second. Then, a strange noise rumbled in his chest. It was a sound she had never seen him make. His eyes crinkled at the corners. His mouth opened, and a deep, hearty laugh escaped him. It was a rare, rich sound, like the vibration of a low chord on a cello, like the sound of solid pine wood splitting clean. She couldn't hear it, But she saw it all. She saw the tension leave his shoulders. She saw the genuine, unbridled amusement, and she laughed too, a silent, joyful echo of his. That night, the fire burned low, painting the log walls in shades of orange and deep red. They sat in their usual places, the book of signs resting on the table between them. They were not signing. They were not writing. They were just sitting. Two shadows flickering on the wall. The shadows danced, sometimes separate, sometimes merging into one, moving in time with the flames. The silence was no longer an absence, no longer a void. It was a presence, as full and as warm as the fire. It was their own song, written in gestures and shadows. The piece of red willow was a fragile thing, a thin pane of ice over the deep, cold water of the town's judgment. After 2 weeks, the need for supplies, flour, salt, coffee became unavoidable. The ride into Thistle Ridge was tense. Jonah rode with his rifle in its scabbard, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines. Ada, riding the dun gelding, felt the tension in his shoulders, a rigid line she had come to read as a sign of coiled, controlled anger. Thistle Ridge was waiting for them. As they rode down the main street, it was as if a silent bell had been rung. Windows that had been empty suddenly had faces in them. Conversations on the boardwalks stopped mid-word. Men whittling on benches let their knives fall still. Ada, her gaze sharp and practiced, saw it all. She saw the women in front of the dry goods store, their hands flying to their mouths to cover their whispers, but their lips were still visible. She read the words, fragmented but clear. Cheap grace. Pike's charity. Took her off Merritt's hands. The silent bride. A group of rough-looking men lounging outside the saloon turned to watch them pass. One of them made a crude gesture, cupping his ear and shaking his head in mockery. Ada felt a hot flush of shame rise up her neck, but she kept her chin high, her eyes fixed forward, just as she had done in the church. Jonah's hand, resting on his thigh near his pistol, clenched into a white-knuckled fist. He said nothing, his face a mask of stone. They tied their horses in front of the general store. The air on the street was thick and still, buzzing with a malice she could feel on her skin. And then, the source of the malice appeared. Merritt Cole stepped out of the bank, flanked by 2 men Ada didn't recognize, men who had the hard, rootless look of hired hands. Merritt looked different. His tailored suit was slightly rumpled, his face puffy and pale. He had been drinking, but his eyes, when they landed on Ada, were sharp and filled with a humiliation that had curdled into venom. He swaggered into the middle of the dusty street, blocking their path to the store's entrance. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice loud enough to carry, "to make this a public performance just like the wedding. If it isn't the happy couple, come to town to show off your prize, Pike." Jonah stopped. He moved to stand slightly in front of Ada. A physical barrier. "Get out of the road, Merritt." His voice was a low growl. Merritt laughed, a high, unpleasant sound. "Or what you're a rancher. Pike, I'm a Cole. You seem to forget what that means in this town." He then turned his full, venomous attention to Ada. He looked her up and down, his lip curling in a sneer. "How's the quiet life, Ada?" he spat. "Was it a good trade? Did you enjoy the charity?" He must be desperate, picking up damaged goods that no one else wanted. A silent, empty-headed doll for a lonely old widower. Ada didn't hear the words. She didn't need to. She read every syllable from his contorted lips. Damaged goods, empty-headed. The insults were not new, but the public, deliberate cruelty of them, coming from the man who was supposed to be her husband, felt like a physical slap. She flinched, her hands instinctively clutching her skirt. The crowd around them was growing, drawn by the scent of a confrontation. They were hungry for the next act of the drama. Jonah took a single, slow step forward. "That's enough." "Is it?" Merritt taunted, emboldened by his audience. "I was just wondering if she makes a sound at all, or is marrying her like owning a piece of quiet furniture." That was the line. Jonah moved, not with the speed of a brawler, but with the terrifying, deliberate force of an avalanche. He crossed the space in 2 strides and seized Merritt by the front of his expensive suit, lifting him half off his feet. "She is worth more," Jonah bit out, his voice shaking with a fury that stunned the onlookers, "than every last coin in your father's vault." Merritt's hired men tensed, their hands moving toward their belts. The crowd gasped. Now, Pike unhand him. Sheriff Gabe Tull came bustling out of his office, his face slick with sweat, his hand resting on his own pistol, but in a gesture of nervous habit, not of threat. "Let him go, Jonah. We'll have no brawling in the street." Jonah held Merritt for 1 more second, his eyes boring into the younger man's, before shoving him backward. Merritt stumbled, landing hard in the dust, his suit ruined. Jonah turned, his chest heaving, and faced the crowd. He looked at the whispering women, at the mocking men, at the families who had come to watch. "You laugh at her," he said, his voice carrying in the sudden, shocked silence. "You whisper and you point, but she is the only person in this entire town who actually knows how to listen." The statement hung in the air, a profound, confusing accusation. The crowd stared, uncomprehending. How could the deaf girl be the only one who listened? And then, Ada moved. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it was something new. The rage she had seen in Jonah's eyes. The strength of his defense. It was a fire she could borrow. She was no longer the girl in the church. She was the woman who had learned his name by hand. She was the woman who had made him laugh. She stepped out from behind Jonah. Her hands were shaking, but not with fear, with fury. She walked past Jonah, past the stunned sheriff, and stood on the bottom step of the boardwalk, placing herself just above Merritt, who was still scrambling in the dirt. She looked at him. Then she lifted her gaze and swept it across the entire crowd. She held up her hands, her movements sharp, clear, and angry. She signed, her fingers cutting the air like knives. "I do not need. Here I see who you are." The crowd was mesmerized. They didn't understand the gestures, but they understood the unblinking, furious honesty in her eyes. They understood the set of her jaw. This was not the broken, pitiful creature from the wedding. This was a woman made of iron. A few people in the crowd broke. Mrs. Gable, the woman who had smirked behind her fan, suddenly found the ground fascinating, her gaze dropping to her own shoes. A couple of ranchers in the back, men who respected hard work and had no love for the bank, exchanged a look. One of them, a man with a weathered face, slowly nodded. A tiny crack had appeared in the town's wall of prejudice. "What's this? What's she doing?" Merritt spat, brushing the dust from his jacket. His bravado shattered into petulant anger. "It's nonsense. She's crazy." "That's enough. All of you," Sheriff Tull barked, finally finding his voice, though it was aimed at the crowd, not at Merritt. "Show's over. Go on. Get—" From the shadows of the bank's doorway, a figure emerged. Abner Sloan, Merritt's father, had been watching the entire exchange. He was a tall, thin man, dressed in a perfectly pressed black suit, his silver hair immaculate. He looked like an undertaker, and in many ways, he was. He stepped onto the boardwalk, his polished boots making no sound. He didn't look at his son. He didn't look at Jonah. He looked at Ada. His eyes were cold, not with anger, but with calculation. It was the look a man gives a horse that has gone lame, or a piece of machinery that has broken. He was reevaluating an asset. She was no longer a pawn in a marriage arrangement. She had become a complication. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a gesture of dismissal, and turned back into the bank. The confrontation was over. The spell was broken. Jonah took Ada's arm, his touch still tight with adrenaline. "We're leaving." He didn't get the supplies. He just pulled her toward the horses, leaving Sheriff Tull to disperse the crowd and Merritt to nurse his ruined pride in the dust. The ride back to Red Willow was silent, but it was a different silence. It was not the comfortable quiet of their evenings. This was a hard, angry silence, filled with the unspoken things that had been brought to the surface. When they reached the ranch, Jonah didn't tend to the horses first. He strode into the main room, grabbed the whiskey bottle from a high shelf, and poured a heavy measure into a tin cup. He drank it in one long, burning swallow. Ada came in and stood by the table, watching him. Her hands were still trembling. Jonah slammed the cup down. "He won't stop," he said, his back to her. He was speaking more to himself than to her. "This isn't just about you. Ada, it was never just about you." He turned to face her, his face grim. He walked to the slate. He needed her to understand all of it. "Red Willow is in debt to Sloane's bank," he explained, with a combination of furious writing and the signs he knew. His late wife, Elspeth, had fallen ill. The winters had been hard, the cattle prices low. He had borrowed heavily. He was behind on his payments. "Sloane wants the ranch," he wrote. Ada looked confused. She signed. Land, poor land. The high plains were hard. Why this ranch? Specifically. Jonah erased his words and wrote again, underlining the last one. "No, he wants the water, Dry Lantern Creek. It starts on my land." The creek, the muddy, slow-moving creek they had crossed, it was the only reliable water source for miles. If Sloane controlled its headwaters, he controlled the entire valley. He could sell the water, or withhold it, strangling every other rancher into submission. Ada's mind raced. The marriage to Merritt. It hadn't been about uniting families. It had been about acquiring the land. If she, as Merritt's wife, had been tied to the ranch, Sloane would have had his claim. Her public humiliation had been Merritt's petty, cruel improvisation. But the plan to take the ranch from Jonah, one way or another, was Sloane's. And now, Jonah had not only denied them the ranch, he had taken Ada, the girl they had cast as worthless. He had defied the bank, and in doing so, had signed his own death warrant. Jonah was pacing, his rage palpable. "He'll find a way to foreclose. He'll use Tull. He'll forge a paper. He'll do whatever it takes." He looked at his rifle, mounted above the fireplace. A man can't be reasoned with when he wants to own the earth. He started toward the gun. Ada saw the look in his eyes, the look that said he was ready to solve this with lead and powder. She ran to him, grabbing his arm with both her hands, her grip surprisingly strong. He stopped, looking down at her, surprised by her force. "No," she signed, her face inches from his, her eyes pleading. "No gun, not like him, no." "It's the only way he'll understand." "Ada," he said, his voice rough. She shook her head, her grip tightening. She pulled him toward the desk, toward the ledgers that his first wife had kept. They were filled with numbers, but also with notes, with the history of the ranch. Ada had been looking through them, trying to understand the finances. She pulled one open, her hands flying. "Fight with truth." "What truth?" Jonah said, exasperated. "The truth is, I'm broke and he's a thief." Ada was frantically turning pages in the oldest ledger. One bound and cracked, dry leather, tucked deep inside, used as a bookmark, was a folded, yellowed piece of paper. She had found it days ago, but hadn't understood its significance. Now, it all clicked into place. She pulled it out. It was not a deed. It was older. It was an old claim document. From before Wyoming was even a territory, it was an agreement with the local Arapaho, granting them seasonal rights to the creek, rights that had been passed down and then, it seemed, sold, but not properly. At the bottom was a proxy signature, authorizing the Thistle Ridge Bank to manage the claim. Jonah stared at it. "I've never seen this." Ada pointed to the proxy signature. Then she pointed to another, newer ledger, one that Jonah himself had signed a loan document in. She pointed to Abner Sloane's neat, meticulous signature as the bank president. Then she pointed back to the old document. The handwriting of the proxy was not Sloane's. It was loops and flourishes, an arrogant, sloppy script. She had seen it before. She grabbed the slate and wrote one word: Merritt. Jonah looked. He compared the forged proxy signature to his memory of Merritt's arrogant scrawl on contracts. It was a match. Sloane had used his own son to forge an old native claim, creating a lien on the water that predated Jonah's deed. They had been planning this for years. Jonah Pike went very still. The rage didn't leave him. It crystallized. It turned from a hot fire to a cold, hard diamond. He looked from the forged paper to his rifle, and then back to Ada. She was watching him, her hand still on his arm. Truth? She signed again. Her gesture soft this time, but insistent. He nodded slowly. Truth. He pulled the map of the valley down from the wall. He spread it on the table next to the ledgers and the forgery. He has his paper, Jonah said, his voice low. We need ours. The plan began to form. They needed more than this one forgery. They needed the bank's ledgers. They needed to find the original claim maps. To see how the creek's flow had been recorded, they needed, as Ada had signed, to see the truth. They bent over the desk, two people against a corrupt and powerful system. A new, more dangerous tension filled the room, the quiet, sharp-edged hum of a plan. And as if in answer, the world outside responded. The light in the room, which had been the clear gold of late afternoon, suddenly dimmed, turning a sick, brownish yellow. A low, deep vibration began. A sound so low it was felt more than heard. Ada looked up, her eyes wide, feeling the floorboards tremble. A sudden violent gust of wind slammed against the house, rattling the new storm shutter on her window as if a giant hand were trying to claw its way in. Dust began to hiss through the cracks in the doorframe. Jonah strode to the window and looked out. The sky had vanished. The world was a swirling, roaring vortex of brown grit. A sandstorm, born of the dry plains, had descended on them with biblical fury. It was a physical assault, an attempt by the wilderness itself to tear them apart. Jonah turned back to Ada, his face a grim shadow in the jaundiced light. He didn't need to say a word. The storm outside was a harbinger. Abner Sloane and his son were not their only enemies. The land itself was hard, and the fight for the truth would be, too. The wind howled, a sound Ada could not hear, but she saw the way it tore at the world, and she knew it was the sound of the battle to come. The sandstorm blew itself out by morning, leaving the world scoured clean and unnervingly quiet. A fine layer of red dust coated everything, a gritty film over the panes of the windows and the wood of the porch. The air was cool and crisp, tasting of damp earth. For Jonah and Ada, the storm had been a crucible, burning away the last of their hesitation. They were no longer a rancher, and the woman he had rescued. They were partners in a fight they had to win. Their first stop was not Thistle Ridge, but the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. A 2-day ride south, the office was a cramped, stuffy room in the back of a brick building, smelling of stale cigar smoke and decaying paper. A bored clerk with a green eye shade barely looked up as they entered. Jonah did the talking, requesting the original survey maps for the Dry Lantern Creek Basin, citing a boundary dispute. The clerk, with a sigh of profound indifference, heaved a massive, leather-bound atlas onto the counter. The book fell open with a dusty sigh. The maps were works of art, drawn in fine black ink on thick, yellowed parchment. The rivers and creeks picked out in faint blue. Ada, her eyes sharp and accustomed to discerning meaning from the faintest of marks, was the one who found it. On the oldest map, dated 1867, Dry Lantern Creek was a single, unbroken blue line running through the heart of the Red Willow claim. But on a newer map, an addendum from 1879, a second, fainter line had been added. It was an irrigation spur, a diversion channel that split off from the main creek just inside Jonah's property line and snaked its way toward land owned by a holding company, a company whose name Jonah recognized from Sloane's ledgers. The ink of the new line was subtly different, the hand that drew it less steady than the original surveyor's. It was a scar on the face of the map. "Who was the surveyor in '79? Jonah asked, his voice low and flat. The clerk, without looking up from his newspaper, grunted. "Retired now. Old man Silas Mudd. Lives in a shack north of Thistle Ridge. Crazy as a loon, they say." Silas Mudd's shack was exactly as the clerk had described it, a crooked, wind-beaten structure that looked as if it were one strong gust away from collapsing into a pile of kindling. They found him sitting on his porch, a thin, bird-like man with watery blue eyes and hands that trembled with a ceaseless palsy. His memory, however, was a different matter. At first he was terrified. He saw Jonah's hard face and Ada's intense, silent gaze and tried to scuttle back inside. "I don't know nothin'," he quavered. "Leave an old man be." Jonah didn't press. He just stood there, his presence as solid and unmovable as the mountains. Ada sat down on the porch step, not looking at Silas, but at his trembling hands. She knew what it was to be afraid. After a long, tense silence, she reached into the satchel they carried and pulled out a small, perfect apple, holding it out to him. The simple act of kindness broke him. Silas began to talk, his voice a reedy whisper, the story tumbling out in a torrent of guilt. He spoke of a visit, years ago, a man from the bank, not Sloane himself, but a younger man, arrogant and well-dressed. This man had brought a bottle of expensive whiskey and a plat of fresh maps. He talked about progress, about optimizing resources. And then he had put the revised map in front of Silas and told him to sign it, to make it official. "I said no," Silas whispered, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "I said it weren't right. The creek's the creek." Then the threats had come. Threats of foreclosure on his own small plot, of being ruined. He had a way about him," Silas stammered. "Like he owned the world, and he was wearing a fancy thing on his shirt cuff." He held up a trembling hand, trying to describe it. "White, like bone, or a tooth." Ada looked at Jonah. An ivory cufflink, a known affectation of Abner Sloane, a symbol of his wealth and power. Sloane hadn't come himself, but he had sent his man, his proxy, wearing his sigil. He had sent Merritt. That night, back at Red Willow, the plan solidified. They had a witness, but a frightened one. They had a forged map. They needed more. They needed the numbers from the bank itself. Ada sat at the desk, the lamp casting a warm circle of light around her. She took out a pen and a fresh sheet of paper. Her mother had not been a woman of means, but she had been a schoolteacher, and she had known people. One of them had been a young, idealistic lawman who had once helped their family. He was now a U.S. Marshal. She wrote with care, her penmanship neat and precise. She did not write a plea for help. She wrote a request for an expert opinion. She described the forged native claim, the suspicious bank seal on the document. She asked if Marshal Amon Ridley could, in his official capacity, verify the authenticity of such a seal. She was not asking him to start a war, only to provide a single, verifiable fact. She sealed the letter, addressing it to Cheyenne. Jonah would ride out at dawn and give it to the eastbound stagecoach driver. But they couldn't wait for a reply. The heart of the conspiracy lay in Sloane's bank, in the ledgers he kept in the back room. The night they chose was moonless, the sky a black velvet cloth pricked with cold. Distant stars. They left the horses tethered in a grove of cottonwoods outside of town and slipped through the back alleys of Thistle Ridge like ghosts. The bank was a dark, silent fortress of brick and stone. Jonah, using a long, thin piece of steel he had fashioned, worked on the lock of a rear window. It opened with a soft, metallic click that sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. He slid inside, then helped Ada through. The air inside was cold, smelling of money, ink, and a faint, cloying scent of Merritt's hair oil. They moved through the darkness. their stockinged feet making no sound on the polished floor. The vault was out of the question, but the ledgers were kept in Sloane's office. Jonah lit a small, shielded lantern, its light a weak, trembling eye in the oppressive dark. They found the books in a tall cabinet. They were heavy, bound in dark green leather, working quickly, their shoulders brushing in the cramped space. They began their work. Ada, her eyes flying across the neat columns of figures, would point to a line item, an exorbitant interest charge, a loan payment that was recorded as missed when they knew it had been made. Her finger would tap the number. Jonah, a sheet of thin carbon paper and a notebook laid out on the desk, would swiftly and silently copy the corresponding entry. They were a machine, a seamless unit of sight and action. A floorboard creaked upstairs. They both froze, their heads snapping up. They heard a door open, then the slow, heavy tread of boots. A night watchman. Jonah snuffed the lantern, plunging them into absolute blackness. They held their breath, listening to the footsteps move slowly across the floor above them. The footsteps stopped, directly overhead, a long, agonizing silence. Then they started again, moving away. They didn't wait for a second chance. Jonah grabbed their notebook. He pointed to the large window at the back of the office. It was their only way out. He slid it open. Below was a sheer drop of 15 feet to the alley, but to the side, pushed up against the wall, was a hay wagon, left there for an early morning delivery. He swung a leg over the sill, then reached back for Ada. "Come on," he mouthed in the darkness. She climbed out after him, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. They clung to the narrow ledge, the rough brick scraping their fingers. Jonah jumped first, landing with a soft thud in the hay. He looked up, his arms outstretched. Ada let go, falling through the darkness, trusting him completely. She landed in the hay beside him, the impact knocking the wind out of her. They lay there for a long moment, side by side in the scratchy darkness, their chests heaving, the smell of dry clover filling their nostrils. She could feel the wild, rapid pulse of his heartbeat through his arm, pressed against hers. It matched her own. They made it back to the ranch before dawn, their clothes full of hay, their nerves raw. They had the evidence, dozens of fraudulent entries, a clear pattern of usury and theft. But as Ada looked at the numbers, another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Some of the ranchers who were being charged the most exorbitant rates for their loans were located downstream from Red Willow. Why? An idea sparked, born of her visual way of thinking. She went to the slate. "Water," she wrote. "At night, bring lantern." Jonah looked at her, confused, but he trusted her instincts. That night, they went down to the banks of Dry Lantern Creek. The water was a black, silent ribbon under the stars. Jonah lit the lantern, holding it out over the surface. And there it was. Caught in the yellow lamplight was a faint, iridescent sheen on the water's surface, a rainbow-colored slick that swirled in the slow current. It was oil, not much, but enough to be unmistakable. Sloane wasn't just planning to steal the water, he was already poisoning it. A slow, methodical contamination that would make the downstream ranches dependent on whatever clean water he chose to sell them from his diverted channel. As they stood there, absorbing this new, uglier truth, Ada saw a movement in the reeds on the far bank. A small figure, a child, was hiding there, watching them. The boy was thin, with wide, frightened eyes and a smudge of dirt on his cheek. Jonah started to call out, but Ada put a hand on his arm, stopping him. She held up her lantern, not as a threat, but as a beacon. She smiled, a soft, reassuring expression. The boy didn't run. He just watched, his eyes fixed not on her face, but on her free hand. Slowly, Ada signed, "Hello?" The boy's eyes widened. He took a hesitant step out of the reeds. He was barefoot, his clothes ragged. Ada signed again. "What is your name?" The boy didn't respond. He just stared, mesmerized. He lifted his own small, dirty hand and tried to mimic her gesture for name, a clumsy, childish imitation. Ada realized with a jolt he wasn't just shy. He couldn't speak. He was a mute. She pointed to herself. ADA, she signed. Then she pointed to him. Her head tilted in a question. The boy opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He pointed to his chest, then made a fist and tapped it twice over his heart. It was a sign she had never seen, one he must have made up himself, but it was a name. It was his name. His eyes, for the first time, were not filled with fear, but with a brilliant, shining light of recognition. He had been seen. His mother found him there a few minutes later, calling his name Toby in a frantic, worried voice. She saw Jonah and Ada and stopped, ready to flee. But then she saw her son, standing by the water, his hands moving, trying to talk to the silent woman from Red Willow. The news spread through the back channels of Thistle Ridge, through the quiet community of the overlooked and the marginalized. It spread not as gossip, but as a fragile tendril of hope. The deaf bride. She had a language. A few days later, a woman appeared at the gate of Red Willow Ranch in the late afternoon. She was leading a young girl by the hand, a girl with vacant eyes who had never spoken a word. The next day, it was a family with a son who had been deafened by a fever. They came hesitantly, with downcast eyes, not as beggars, but as supplicants. They came to the one person in the valley who might understand. Ada met them on the wide front porch. She didn't offer miracles. She offered a word. She would sit with a child, take their small hand in hers, and slowly, patiently, form the sign for Wayo or mother or son. The porch of Red Willow Ranch transformed. It became a school. It became a church. It became the heart of a new community, a place where forgotten voices were given hands, where silence was not an absence, but a language waiting to be learned. Jonah watched it all. He saw the way Ada came alive in the presence of these children. He saw the hope she was creating out of thin air. He did not interfere. He just helped. One morning, he began clearing a patch of ground near the house. He started laying a foundation, cutting fresh pine boards. He was building a new room, a simple, single-room structure with a large window to let in the afternoon light. It was to be a schoolhouse, a promise, built of wood and nails. That evening, Ada stood on the porch, watching him work as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of rose and violet. The children and their families had gone home. The ranch was quiet again, but it was a different quiet. It was full of the echoes of shared words, of new connections. She looked at the small, sturdy building taking shape. She looked at the man who had defended her, who had learned her language, who was now building a future she had never dared to imagine. She lifted her hand in the fading light. She signed a word she had never used before, a word she had thought was not hers to own. H-O-P-E. The late night was a deep, velvet silence, the kind that follows a storm. The adrenaline from their break-in at the bank had long since faded, leaving in its wake a profound, shared exhaustion that was more intimate than any conversation. A single oil lamp burned on the main table, its flames swaying with the drafts of the old house. The light threw long, dancing shadows on the log walls, making the room seem to breathe in the darkness. On the ceiling, the reflection of the glass chimney warped and wobbled, a captured star swimming in a jar of night. Ada stood in her small room, the one that had once felt like a stranger's, but now felt like a sanctuary. She was looking into the small, silver-backed mirror that hung from a nail on the wall. Her reflection was a stranger she was just beginning to know. The face that stared back was smudged with dust from the alley and streaked with sweat from their flight. Her hair, a heavy coronet of braids, was coming undone, loose tendrils clinging to her temples. But her eyes were different. They were not the haunted, wary eyes of the girl who had entered the church weeks ago. They were bright, sharp, and alive with a fierce, dangerous light. Slowly, her hands came up to her hair. One by one, She pulled the heavy bone pins free. She felt the release as the tight braids loosened, the weight lifting from her scalp. She shook her head, and her hair cascaded down her back and over her shoulders, a river of dark wheat in the lamplight. It was a release of the day, of the tension, of the woman she was supposed to be. Her gaze remained fixed on her own reflection. Her hands, moving with a deliberate slowness, went to the high collar of her dress. It was a practical, sturdy garment, but now it felt like a uniform, stiff with the grime and fear of their clandestine mission. Her fingers worked at the small buttons, unfastening them one by one. She pushed the dusty fabric off her shoulders, letting the outer layer of her dress slide down her arms and pool at her feet. A shed skin of the world outside. She stood there for a moment in her simple chemise, a pale shape in the flickering gloom. It was not an act of seduction, but of reclamation. She was stripping away the fight to find the woman underneath. A shadow fell across the doorway. She didn't flinch. She had felt the vibration of his approach through the floorboards, a slow, heavy tread that was as familiar to her now as her own heartbeat. Jonah stood on the threshold. He did not speak. He simply stopped, his large frame filling the doorway. He had been outside, checking the horses, and the cool night air clung to him. He held his dusty hat in both hands, twisting the brim in a gesture of uncertainty. He just looked at her, and Ada, watching his face in the mirror, understood that his gaze held none of the things she had feared from men her whole life. There was no ownership, no hunger, no appraisal. There was only a profound, quiet awe and a deep, bone-weary respect. He was not looking at a woman undressing. He was looking at his partner, his fellow conspirator, the person who had just walked through fire with him and had not burned. His stillness was a question, an apology for intruding, and a statement that he could not bring himself to leave. She turned from the mirror to face him directly. The lamplight was behind him, casting his face in shadow, but she could see the glint of it in his storm-gray eyes. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was charged, filled with everything they had been through, with all the words they had learned to say without a sound. Her hands rose, the movement slow, almost reluctant, as if she were afraid of the answer to the question she had to ask. In the warm, wavering light, she signed, her fingers shaping the words with painful precision. Not out of pity. The question hung in the air between them, the ghost of every sidelong glance, every whispered comment, every act of condescending charity she had ever endured. Pity was the cage she had lived in her entire life. She had to know, with absolute certainty, that he had not just built her a larger, more comfortable one. Jonah's expression did not change, but a muscle tightened in his jaw. He did not answer with his clumsy, still-learning signs. He answered with a language that was older, more elemental. He raised his right hand and placed it flat over his own heart, a solid, grounding pressure. He held it there for a beat, letting her see the sincerity of the gesture. Then, he moved his hand from his chest and held it out in the space that separated them, palm open, fingers slightly curled, as if offering her the very choice he was about to name. He looked directly into her eyes and mouthed a single, silent word, forming it with such care that she could not possibly mistake it. Choice. He had not saved her. He had chosen her. In the church, in the street, in the dark of the bank. It was not an act of mercy for the weak, but of recognition for an equal. The word landed in the center of her being and dissolved the last of her fear. A single tear, hot and cleansing, escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. She closed the distance between them. She did not rush into his arms. She walked toward him until her bare feet were inches from his dusty boots, until she had to tilt her head back to see his face. She raised her hands, not to sign, but to touch. She placed her palms flat against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him through his shirt, the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart beneath her hands. It was the same rhythm she had felt in the hay wagon, the beat of a life intertwined with her own. Then, she rose onto her toes and gently, trustingly, pressed her forehead against his. The world seemed to stop. She could feel the faint, rough stubble of his jaw against her temple, smell the clean scent of sage and cool night air that clung to him. His breath was warm on her face. He did not move, did not try to take control. He simply stood, a mountain of a man, allowing her this fragile, profound intimacy. Their breathing, which had been ragged with tension, began to sink, his exhale becoming her inhale, two separate lives finding a single, shared rhythm. She pulled back just enough to look at him. A small, tentative smile touched her lips. She saw a shawl, one of her mother's, lying on the cot. She reached for it, her movements fluid and confident. She was not covering herself out of modesty. She was wrapping herself in her own history, her own strength. She draped it over her shoulders, a queen donning her own humble robes. She looked at him, her eyes clear and unwavering. She was no longer asking a question. She was making a statement. Jonah seemed to understand the shift. The moment was no longer his to navigate. It was hers. He lifted his hand, the same one he had offered in the space between them, and held it out to her. This time, it was not a declaration, it was an invitation. Lead the way. She placed her hand in his rough, calloused fingers closed around hers, a familiar, comforting weight. She led him from the doorway of her small room into the main living space, toward the warm, dying embers of the hearth. She stopped before the fireplace, turning to face him. The light from the lamp was behind them now, painting them as two dark silhouettes against the glowing orange of the coals. She raised her free hand and gently touched his face, her fingers tracing the hard line of his jaw. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch like a weary traveler finding shade. The kiss, when it came, was as quiet and as natural as the settling of a house at night. It was not a sudden claiming, but a slow arrival. It was like the first warm Chinook wind after a long, hard winter, a gentle, melting promise. His lips were soft, hesitant, a stark contrast to the rough texture of his face. It was a kiss of profound respect, of questions asked and answered, of a deep and abiding tenderness that went beyond words. His arms came around her, holding her as if she were something infinitely precious, something he had been waiting for his entire life without knowing it. And their hands, their primary language, did not stop speaking. Her fingers trailed from his jaw up to his temple, then threaded into his thick, dark hair. His hand moved from her waist up her back, a slow, reassuring pressure that spoke of safety and protection. They were talking still, a silent conversation of touch that conveyed a universe of meaning on her shoulder, his arm, the small of her back. A gust of wind rattled the storm shutter he had built, causing the lamp flame to leap and flicker. For a moment, their two shadows, cast long on the log wall, merged and became one. It was a fleeting, perfect union, an image of two separate souls finding a single outline in the warm, uncertain light. They did not retire to their separate rooms. When the kiss ended, they simply stood, holding each other in the warmth of the dying fire. After a long time, Jonah retrieved a thick wool blanket from his own bed. He laid it on the worn bearskin rug before the hearth. They sank down onto it, not facing each other, but sitting side by side, their backs resting against the warm stones of the fireplace, pulling the single blanket over their shared laps. They sat in that comfortable, peaceful silence for a long time, watching the embers glow and fade. The house was quiet. The world was quiet. Finally, Ada looked at him. She lifted her hand, her movement soft in the dim light. She signed a single, simple word. Home. Jonah watched her. He did not need to mouth a reply. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, the one she had seen only once before, the one that lit his eyes from within. It was an answer more profound than any word. He reached over, took her hand, and brought it to his lips, pressing a soft kiss into her palm. Then he looked at her and mouthed his own vow. just for her. Always. Outside, the high plateau wind moved through the crimson leaves of the willows by the creek. It was not a mournful sound. It was a soft, rushing sigh, a sound like 1,000 hands clapping together in a silent, standing ovation. That night, for Ada Lark, silence was no longer the mark of her isolation, and for Jonah Pike, it was no longer the sound of his loneliness. It had become the language of their commitment, the quiet, steady foundation of a home they had built together in the heart of the wilderness. The stagecoach from Cheyenne did not arrive with its usual cloud of dust and rattling harness. It was escorted by 2 riders, one of whom was a man who wore his authority like a second skin. U.S. Marshal Amon Ridley was tall and lean, with a sun-weathered face and eyes the color of a faded blue shirt eyes that missed nothing. He carried a federal warrant, a piece of paper that held more power in the territory than Abner Sloan's entire vault. They went directly to the bank. Sheriff Gabe Tull, flustered and out of his depth, trailed behind them like a nervous tugboat in the wake of a battleship. Abner Sloan met them at the door, his face a mask of polite, professional concern. He was the picture of calm, offering the marshal a seat and inquiring as to the nature of this unfortunate misunderstanding. Merritt, however, was a different story. When he saw the star on Ridley's chest, the color drained from his face. A fine sheen of sweat broke out on his upper lip, and he began dabbing at it with a silk handkerchief. His movements jerky and unnatural, his starched collar, usually a symbol of his status, suddenly seemed to shrink around his thick neck, choking him. The preliminary hearing was not held in a proper courthouse, but in the town hall, a large, drafty room that smelled of floor polish and stale civic duty. Circuit Judge Harlan Graves, a man with a beard like a snowdrift and a reputation for being as unmovable as a boulder, presided. The room was packed. Every soul in Thistle Ridge who could fit had crammed themselves inside, their faces a sea of hungry curiosity. The evidence was laid out on a long table in the center of the room, the surveyor's maps, old and new, the carbon copies of the forged ledger entries from Jonah's notebook, and the original, yellowed Arapaho claim with Merritt's fraudulent signature. "Mrs. Pike," the judge said, his voice a low rumble, "you and your husband have made some serious accusations. The floor is yours." Ada rose. She did not look like a warrior, in her simple gray dress, with her hair pulled back neatly. She looked like what she was, a quiet, unassuming woman. But when she stood, a stillness came over her, a focus so intense it seemed to draw all the air in the room toward her. Jonah stood beside her. He was not there to protect her, but to serve as her voice. Ada began, not with words, but with a piece of chalk on a large slate. She wrote, "The bank is a thief, the water is the proof." Then, she put the slate down. She looked at Judge Graves, at the jury of townspeople, and at Abner Sloan. Her hands came up. "Let the record show," Jonah's voice boomed, filling the room, "that my wife will now present her testimony. I will translate her signs." A murmur went through the crowd. Merritt snorted in derision. "Silence," Judge Graves ordered. His gaze settled on Ada. "Son, you translate, but everyone else in this room," he said, his eyes sweeping over the spectators. "You will watch her. You will give this woman the respect of your attention." A hush fell. For the first time, the town was being commanded not just to tolerate Ada, but to see her. She started with the maps, her long, slender fingers tracing the original, true path of Dry Lantern Creek. Her hands then moved to the forged diversion channel. Her signs sharp, angry, Jonah translated. She says, "The map was changed. The water was stolen on paper before it was ever stolen from the earth." She moved to the ledgers. Her hands flew, a blur of motion, pointing to the carbon copies, then to the men in the crowd she knew had been cheated. She didn't need to speak their names. She just looked at them, and her hands told their stories. Her signs softened, becoming almost sorrowful. She looked toward the back of the room, where Toby's mother stood, holding her son's hand. Ada made the sign Toby had shown her. A fist tapped twice over her heart. She then mimed drinking water and then clutching her stomach in pain. She signed about the oil, the sickness in the downstream cattle, the fear. Jonah's voice was low, heavy with the weight of her words. She speaks for Toby, who has no voice. He showed her the sickness in the water. He saw what others would not. She spoke for the widow Nell, whose husband had died in a mining accident at a claim Sloane had repossessed for a paltry debt. Ada's hands mimed a pickaxe swinging, then a man falling, then a woman weeping alone in an empty house. She spoke for the old miner, deafened by a dynamite blast, who had been cheated out of his pension with a contract he couldn't read and no one would explain. Her hands cupped her ear and shook her head, a mirror of her own experience, a bridge of shared silence. She was giving voice to the voiceless, weaving their separate, silent griefs into a single, undeniable tapestry of Sloane's greed. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with a collective, long-buried resentment. Merritt could stand it no longer. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly on the floor. "Objection! This is a circus. She's making it all up. She can't hear a thing. How could she possibly know any of this?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Ada. She did not flinch from Merritt's outburst. She looked directly at him, her eyes as clear and cold as creek water in winter. Her hands came up, and she made two sharp, deliberate signs. Jonah's voice cut through the tension like an axe. "Because see?" The words struck the room like a physical blow. Merritt staggered back as if he'd been shot, slumping into his chair. He was right. She couldn't hear, but that was her power. While the rest of the town had been listening to Sloane's promises and Merritt's boasts, she had been watching. She had seen the truth in their shifty eyes, in their cruel mouths, in the tremble of a forged signature. "Do you have any proof of this coercion?" the judge asked, his eyes still on Ada. At the back of the room, a frail figure rose. Silas Mudd, the old surveyor, shuffled forward, his entire body trembling. He clutched something in his fist. He did not look at Sloane. He looked at Ada, and in her eyes, he seemed to find a courage he hadn't known he possessed. He reached the table and opened his hand. With a shaking finger, he pushed a small, white object into the center of the table. It was an ivory cufflink. He gave me this," Silas stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "Said it was a token of our arrangement. He made me change the map. He said he'd ruin me." His gaze finally lifted, a watery, terrified accusation, and pointed a trembling finger at Abner Sloane. Before Sloane could even form a denial, Marshal Ridley stepped forward. "Your Honor, this cufflink corroborates Mr. Mudd's testimony, but it is not all we have." He placed a heavy locked strongbox on the table and opened it with a key. Inside was a stack of official-looking documents. "In my search of the bank's records, conducted under federal warrant, we found Mr. Sloane's private files. It seems he was not just diverting water from Red Willow, he was diverting water from everyone." He pulled out a contract. "This is a water rights transfer from the Miller homestead. Except," he said, holding it up, "Mr. Miller has been dead for 5 years. The signature is a forgery." He pulled out another. "And another, from the Jacobson Ranch, signed on a day when we know for a fact Mr. Jacobson was in a hospital in Denver." A wave of outrage rippled through the courtroom. Shouts erupted. "Thief! Liar!" "Order!" Judge Graves roared, slamming his gavel down. "Order in this courtroom." The noise subsided, but the anger remained, a simmering, dangerous heat. All eyes were on Abner Sloane. The mask of calm had finally cracked. A flush of deep, mottled red was creeping up his neck. His composure, the tool of his trade, had shattered. "This is an outrage," he blustered, getting to his feet. "These are legitimate business practices. I was simply optimizing public assets for the betterment of the community." The admission, couched in the arrogant language of a tyrant, was all the judge needed to hear. Optimizing. "Mr. Sloane," Judge Graves said, his voice dangerously soft. "It seems to me you were stealing. You were strangling this valley for your own personal profit." He raised his gavel. "This is a preliminary hearing, but the evidence presented is overwhelming. I am issuing an immediate injunction. All assets of the Thistle Ridge Bank are hereby frozen. Pending a full federal audit, a restraining order is issued, forbidding Mr. Sloane, Mr. Cole, or any of their agents from setting foot on or otherwise interfering with the Red Willow Ranch." He looked directly at Sloane. "The final hearing will be set for the fall, after the harvest. I suggest you find a very good lawyer. You are dismissed." The gavel fell with a crack of finality. Ada felt the tension drain out of her, leaving her weak-kneed and trembling. Jonah's strong hand found hers, holding her steady. They had won. It wasn't over, but they had won the battle. As they moved to leave, the crowd parted for them. Ada, exhausted but standing tall, felt a pair of eyes burning into her. She turned. Merritt was being restrained by Sheriff Tull, his face a mask of pure, undiluted hatred. He mouthed the words at her, a silent, venomous promise. "This isn't over." Jonah saw it too. He squeezed her hand and led her out into the bright, clean sunlight of the street. "The closer you get to the truth," he said quietly, his voice a low rumble just for her, "the harder the wind blows." The townspeople were spilling out of the hall onto the steps. They gave them a wide berth, as if Ada and Jonah were surrounded by an invisible, crackling energy. But it was different this time. There were no smirks, no whispers. As they walked down the steps, the weathered rancher who had nodded in the street a few weeks before met Ada's eye. He didn't speak. He just touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of profound, unadorned respect. A few others did the same. A woman, one who had previously whispered behind her hand, gave a small, hesitant nod. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was a beginning. It was the first, faint sound of a town learning to see. The night before the Harvest Festival was supposed to be a time of rest, of quiet anticipation. The year's hard work was done. The grain was cut and threshed, and the massive community grain elevator stood on the edge of town like a wooden cathedral, its silos filled with the collective wealth and future of Thistle Ridge. A cool, dry wind whispered down from the high plains, carrying the sweet, dusty scent of cured wheat and the promise of a celebratory dawn. The first sign was not a sound, but a light, a strange, flickering orange that painted the underside of the clouds. Ada, standing on the porch of Red Willow, saw it first. She had come outside to feel the night air, to watch the stars in the vast, silent sky. She saw the unnatural glow and felt a low, deep vibration through the soles of her bare feet, a hum that was wrong. She looked toward the town. A pillar of smoke, blacker than the night itself, was uncoiling into the sky, lit from below by that hungry, malevolent orange. The community grain elevator was on fire. Jonah burst out of the house, drawn by the sudden, panicked change in her posture. He followed her gaze, and a low curse escaped his lips. The prairie wind, the same wind that had dried the harvest so perfectly, was now a bellows, fanning the flames, pushing the fire into a solid, roaring wall of red that was beginning to lick at the black sky. The wordless message of the fire spread through the valley. Distant shouts, sounds Ada could not hear, were swallowed by the wind, but the light was its own alarm, a terrible, silent scream. Whispers turned to panicked accusations in the flickering light of the town. "It's Pike," someone shouted, his face contorted in fear and anger. "It has to be. Revenge for the court. Sloane's men. More like," another voice countered, but it was drowned out by the rising tide of panic. Sheriff Gabe Tull stood in the middle of the street, a bucket in one hand, his face a mask of indecisive agony. He looked at the inferno devouring the town's livelihood. Then his gaze drifted out toward the dark shape of the hills where Red Willow Ranch lay. He was a man caught between a disaster and a devil. and he didn't know which one to fight first. Ada didn't wait for the town to organize. She didn't wait for permission. She was already running. She was not a big woman, but she moved with a desperate, focused energy. She ran past the panicked clusters of people, her eyes fixed on the one building that could speak for her, the church. The heavy oak doors were unlocked. She threw her weight against them and stumbled into the silent, cavernous space, the stained glass windows now glowing with a hellish, red light. She ran down the aisle, the same aisle she had walked in humiliation, and grabbed the thick, rough bell rope. She pulled. Her feet lifted off the floor with the effort. The rope was heavy, designed for a man's strength, but she pulled again and again, her arms straining, her muscles screaming in protest. High above, the massive bronze bell began to swing. It let out a single, deep, mournful bong, a sound that cut through the roar of the fire, then another, and another. She was not ringing an alarm for a fire they could already see. She was calling them to order. The rhythmic, steady toll was a physical command, a visual metronome against the chaos. She was using the church's voice, not with sound, but with a powerful, visible rhythm, calling the people to a single purpose. Jonah, meanwhile, had seen the same thing Ada had: the wind. Fighting the fire head-on was impossible. The wind would just throw the water back in their faces. But he also saw the town's salvation, the ultimate irony. He roared for riders, his voice a gravelly command that cut through the panic. To the diversion channel now. A half-dozen ranchers, men who knew the land and respected Jonah's judgment, didn't hesitate. They mounted their horses and galloped after him, a desperate cavalry charge against an enemy of flame. They thundered through the night to the very irrigation spur that Sloane had used to steal their water, its channel now running full. "Break the dam!" Jonah bellowed, leaping from his horse. They attacked the hastily built earthen dam with shovels, pickaxes, and their bare hands. It was a frantic, brutal struggle against mud and wood. The fire cast their shadows, huge and monstrous, against the landscape as they worked, with a final, groaning tear. The dam gave way, a torrent of dark, churning water. The lifeblood of the valley was unleashed. It surged down the channel, no longer heading for Sloane's empty fields, but turning, inexorably, toward the heart of the fire. Back in town, the water from the town well was proving useless, the buckets of water thrown against the burning silo turning to steam with a defeated hiss. The heat was a physical blow, driving people back, but then Ada appeared. She had left the bell rope and now stood in the swirling smoke, her face grimed with soot, her eyes burning with an intensity that outshone the flames. She grabbed the arm of a panicked man. She got his attention, her sharp gesture a command. She pointed to him, then to the well, then to the person next to him, and then to the fire, her hands creating a clear, unmistakable line. You, water, him, fire, a bucket brigade. It was a simple idea, but in the chaos, no one had been able to organize it. Ada, with her silent, absolute clarity, became the organizing principle, and then her students appeared. Toby and the other children who had been coming to her porch school pushed their way through the crowd. They saw her hands moving and understood immediately. While the adults were still shouting over each other, trying to be heard above the roar, the children became Ada's lieutenants. She would sign a command. More buckets here. Watch that falling beam form a second line from the horse trough, and the children would instantly relay the message, running to the right people, their small hands mimicking her signs with perfect, urgent clarity. They received their orders faster and more clearly than anyone else. They were a network of silent, efficient communication in the heart of the bedlam. The townspeople, in their desperation, began to follow. They stopped shouting and started watching Ada's hands, and the hands of the children. The brigade began to work, a single, unified organism, a chain of human will against the destructive force of the fire. It was Marshal Ridley who saw merit. He and a few deputies had been trying to secure the area behind the elevator when they saw three figures outlined against the flames, trying to slip away into the darkness. One was Merritt Cole. The other two were the same hard-faced strangers who had flanked him in the street. They were standing next to a large, overturned barrel of lamp oil, its contents soaking into the ground near the elevator's foundation. They had not just set the fire, they had come to make sure it finished the job. "Halt, Federal Marshal!" Ridley shouted. Merritt's head snapped around, his face a mask of pure, feral panic in the firelight. He didn't hesitate. He turned and ran. He scrambled away, not toward the street, but toward the low-lying ground near the creek bed. The same ground where the redirected water from the diversion channel was now beginning to pool. He fled, his expensive boots slipping and sliding. A coward's retreat. He didn't get far. He hit the newly formed patch of thick, black mud and went down hard, his flailing arms sending up a spray of filthy water. He was trapped, a pathetic, mud-caked figure, his arrogance washed away, leaving only his guilt. As the diverted creek water surged around the base of the grain elevator, the fire met its match. The battle was a terrible, elemental thing, roaring flame against hissing water. A huge cloud of steam and black smoke billowed into the sky, blotting out the stars. The main silo, its supports undermined by fire and water, groaned in protest, with a sound like a giant tree splitting apart. One entire side of the structure collapsed inward, but the water had done its work. The advance of the flames was stopped. The core of the elevator, and the thousands of bushels of wheat inside, was saved. The crowd stood in stunned, panting silence, their faces lit by the dying, sullen glow of the embers. They looked at the saved grain, then at the collapsed wall, and then at the small, soot-stained woman who stood in the middle of it all. Her hands, which had been in constant, commanding motion, were now hanging limply at her sides. She had not shouted a single command, yet she had led them. In the midst of the roaring chaos, her silence had been the most powerful voice of all. With the immediate danger past, Sheriff Tull finally found his courage. He marched over to the sputtering, mud-covered Merritt Cole, who was being held by Ridley's men, and snapped a pair of handcuffs on his wrists with a decisive, satisfying click. The fight was over. The adrenaline that had sustained Ada vanished, and the smoke she had been breathing for the last hour hit her with its full, poisonous force. A wave of dizziness washed over her. The world tilted, the glowing embers swimming before her eyes. She coughed, a dry, racking sound, and her knees buckled. Jonah was there before she hit the ground. He swept her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing. He held her close, his face a mask of gentle terror, and carried her away from the smoke and ash. Her head rested against his chest, her cheek pressed to his shirt, which was soaked with sweat and smelled of smoke. They laid her on a cot in a makeshift aid station set up in the town hall. When she woke a few minutes later, the first thing she saw was Jonah's face, etched with worry. The second was Marshal Ridley. Standing nearby, she felt the rough texture of Jonah's hand holding hers. She coughed, her throat raw. She squeezed his hand to get his attention. Her other hand came up, her fingers moving weakly, but with their usual, unwavering clarity. "We," spoke, loudly, "tonight." A small, weary smile touched Jonah's lips. He nodded. Marshal Ridley stepped closer, his hat in his hands. "Ma'am," he said, his voice full of a gruff respect, "tonight, everyone saw." When Jonah finally carried her out to the wagon to take her home, the sun was just beginning to touch the eastern horizon with a faint, bruised purple. The townspeople were still there, huddled in exhausted groups, surveying the damage, but as Jonah and Ada passed, a path cleared for them. No one spoke. No one had the words. They arrived back at Red Willow Ranch as the dawn broke, painting the landscape in soft shades of rose and gold, and they saw it. On their front porch, left there in a silent, collective offering, was a collection of humble gifts, a freshly baked loaf of bread, still warm, wrapped in a clean dishcloth, a jug of fresh milk, a small basket of late-season apples, a jar of honey. It was not a reward, it was not charity, it was a silent, clumsy, and profoundly beautiful apology. It was the sound of a town finally, truly, listening. The fall brought a verdict that was as crisp and final as the air. The trial of Abner Sloan and Merritt Cole was swift, with the meticulous evidence from the bank's own ledgers, the damning testimony of Silas Mudd, and the cold, factual report from Marshal Ridley's office. There was no escape. Abner Sloan, the man who had seen Thistle Ridge as his personal chessboard, was found guilty of fraud, extortion, and unlawful coercion. His son, Merritt, whose arrogance had been the catalyst for his father's downfall, was convicted as an accomplice to both the fraud and the arson of the grain elevator. The sight of both men being led away in irons by Marshal Ridley, their fine suits rumpled and their faces ashen, was an image that purged the town of its long-held fear. The bank was dissolved, its assets seized by the territorial government to repay the ranchers it had systematically strangled. The age of Sloan was over. The water of Dry Lantern Creek was, by judicial decree, returned to its original, natural course. But Ada, in her testimony, had proposed something more. The land immediately bordering the disputed diversion channel, the very land Sloan had coveted, was not returned to Red Willow. At her signed request, which Jonah had translated with a quiet pride, it was placed into a community trust, forever designated for public use, a communal grazing area and a source of water for anyone in the valley. It was an act of grace that stunned the courtroom. She had not sought revenge, but restoration. She had not sought to hoard the resource, but to share it. With the bank's false debts erased, Red Willow Ranch was free. A weight Jonah had carried for years, a burden that had stooped his broad shoulders, simply evaporated. He walked differently, breathed differently, and he poured this newfound energy not into his fields, but into a promise. He kept the small schoolhouse separate from the main house, a freestanding testament to the future. He built it from aspen wood, and when the sun struck it in the morning, the pale, smooth logs seemed to glow from within. He put in a wide, four-paned glass window that faced south, and the room was perpetually flooded with a clear, golden light. He did not build the rough benches of a typical frontier school. He built small, sturdy tables and low chairs, designed for children, designed for them to gather around and share a single visual space. The room smelled of fresh-cut wood, of sap, and of hope. The day he finished, he and Ada stood in the doorway, the light streaming around them. He had swept the last of the wood shavings from the floor. He looked at the empty waiting room, then at her. He seemed to want to say something, but the new, shared language of their hands felt suddenly inadequate, too small for the emotion that filled his chest. Instead, he took her hand and led her from the schoolhouse. He walked her past the porch, past the main house, and down the gentle slope toward the creek bed, to the place where the three massive red willows stood, their leaves now a fiery crimson in the autumn light. He stopped beneath the largest one, its branches forming a rustling, sun-dappled canopy above them. He turned to face her. He was still holding her hand. He didn't speak. He didn't sign. He just looked at her. His storm-gray eyes, usually so guarded, now completely open, vulnerable, and filled with a light that matched the room he had just built. Then, to her astonishment, he knelt, not just a token bend of the knee, but a full, formal genuflection. Placing one knee in the soft grass and fallen leaves, it was not a gesture of supplication or ritual. It was an act of profound, deliberate truth. He was bringing himself lower, meeting her at a different level, acknowledging her as the force that had reshaped his world. From his pocket, he took a small, simple ring. It was not gold, not diamond. It was plain, polished silver, shining in the filtered light like a captured drop of creek water. He didn't hold it up as a prize. He just held it in the palm of his rough, calloused hand, offering it as a simple, physical fact. Ada's breath caught in her throat. She looked from the ring. shining in his palm, to his face. Her hands rose, trembling slightly, forming the words that had haunted her since that first day in the church. Not for duty, not because you had to. Jonah set the ring gently on the grass. He took both of her trembling hands in his. He held them firmly, grounding her. He looked into her eyes, and she watched his lips, knowing this was a moment that required both languages, the spoken and the seen. He mouthed the words slowly, with perfect, agonizing clarity, his own voice a low vibration she felt through their joined hands, a sound like the world shifting on its axis. For love. He paused, letting her read the shape of the words, letting the truth of them land. Then, he mouthed them again, a silent renewal of the vow. For love. Her hands, freed from his, flew to her face, a gesture of overwhelming, silent joy. He picked up the ring and waited. She nodded, a single, convulsive motion, and held out her hand. He slid the simple silver band onto her finger. It was cool, solid, and real. He rose to his feet and pulled her to him, his arms wrapping around her, holding her as if she were the anchor and he were the one who had been adrift. Their second wedding was nothing like the first. It took place 3 days later, in the same spot, under the red willows, just as the sun was beginning its descent, bathing the valley in a warm amber light. There was no crowd, there was no spectacle. The only guests were Marshal Ridley, who had delayed his departure, Reverend Miller, who looked on with a face of profound, quiet redemption, and the half-dozen families, including Toby and his mother, who had been the first to trust Ada. The children sat in the grass, their faces scrubbed, watching with solemn, curious eyes. There were no decorations, save for the crimson leaves of the willows and a few late-season asters and goldenrod that Ada had gathered and held in her hand. There was no music. The only sound was the rustle of the wind in the leaves and the soft, clear voice of the Reverend. But the silence was filled. As the Reverend spoke the traditional words, Ada and Jonah faced each other, their hands moving in a quiet, simultaneous translation. They were not just listening to the ceremony, they were performing it, creating their own vows in the language of their hands. When the time came for the exchange, Jonah signed his promise to her, his large hands moving with a new, practiced grace, and she signed hers to him. Reverend Miller watched them, his eyes moist, and simply said, "Amen." Ada didn't wait for the Reverend's final pronouncement. She reached up and placed her hand gently on Jonah's cheek, a gesture that had become their most private vow. He leaned into her touch, covering her hand with his own. This was their pledge all the days they had lived, all the fires they had walked through, all the silences they had shared. It did not need to be spoken. It had already been proven. Then, a smile touched her lips. She stepped back, still holding his hand, with a gentle, playful tug. She pulled him into the open, grassy space beside the willows. She placed one hand on his shoulder and, with her other, lifted his hand, placing it on her waist. He understood. He put his arm around her, and she rested her head against his chest. With no music to guide them, Ada began to move, to sway. She created the rhythm, and he followed. They began to dance, a slow, silent waltz on the uneven ground. The children watched, captivated. It was a dance of pure, unadorned intimacy. The golden, late afternoon sun cast their shadows long on the grass. Two shapes, separate but joined, turning and swirling like clouds drifting over a quiet hill. When they returned to the small gathering, breathing slightly from the exertion, Sheriff Gabe Tull stepped forward, his hat in his hands, his face a mixture of awkwardness and sincere respect. He was not wearing his star, but he was holding a large, newly forged iron key. "Mrs. Pike," he said, his voice rough, "on behalf of the town, And as the new chairman of the Community Grain Cooperative, we'd be honored if you'd accept the key to the new elevator." He held it out to her. It was a public act of contrition, a formal, humble apology from the entire town, delivered by the man who had once been afraid to stand up for her. Jonah translated the words, but Ada had already understood the gesture. She accepted the key, her small hand closing around the heavy iron. She nodded to Tull, a nod of forgiveness and of shared purpose. Marshal Ridley was the last to approach. He held the worn, leather-bound ledger that Jonah had kept, the one filled with the ranch's numbers, but also with the truths he had written. "Heard you built a school, Mrs. Pike," Ridley said, his eyes crinkling. Then he turned to Jonah and clapped him on the shoulder, pressing the ledger back into his hands. "You keep writing, Pike," the marshal said, his voice low. "You keep this. You write down what happened here, this town. It needs its new stories. It needs to remember what's true." He nodded to them both, mounted his horse, and rode east, a solitary, righteous figure disappearing into the long shadows. That evening, Ada stood on the porch of the main house. The wind was cool and carried the rich, sweet scent of newly cut hay from a neighbor's field. In the yard, the children, including Toby, were playing, their game a wild, joyous, and utterly silent chase around the new schoolhouse. Toby, no longer a frightened shadow, was laughing, his whole body shaking with a soundless mirth, his hands flying as he shouted to his friends. Ada watched them, the silver ring on her finger a cool, solid weight, the iron key to the town's future resting on the table beside her. Her heart felt so full it ached. She looked at the children, at the new building, at the wide, peaceful valley, and her lips formed a single, silent word to the sky, to the land, to the man who was now walking up from the barn to stand beside her. "Thank you." Jonah came up the steps and put his arm around her, pulling her close. They stood together, watching the sun dip behind the western ridge. The last rays of light shot up, painting the clouds in streaks of vibrant orange and deep rose, as if a giant had thrown a bolt of silk cloth across the entire, endless Wyoming sky. The Founders' Day celebration was unlike any Thistle Ridge had seen before. The bitterness of the past had been scoured away, leaving the town feeling new, as if it had been given a second chance at its own founding. The celebration was held not on the dusty main street, but on the wide green lawn behind the church, a place of new beginnings. Calico banners, stitched by the women of the valley, snapped in the crisp autumn breeze, their bright colors a stark contrast to the somber tones of the past. Long trestle tables, borrowed from every home, were lined up end to end until they seemed to stretch to the horizon, groaning under the weight of a communal feast. Roasted chickens, mountains of cornbread, pies of every description, and barrels of fresh-pressed cider. The air smelled of baked sugar, roasting meat, and the clean, sharp scent of fall. People mingled freely, their faces open and relaxed. The rigid social strata that Sloan's Bank had imposed for so long had crumbled. Rough-handed ranchers stood talking with the town's merchants, their wives exchanging recipes. Children, a dozen of them now, chased each other through the crowd, their silent, flashing hands a natural, accepted part of the day's boisterous energy. It was not a gathering of suspicious neighbors, but a family reunion. In the center of the lawn, a low wooden platform had been erected. It was not a stage for a politician or a preacher. It was for Ada. When the time came, a hush fell over the crowd. Jonah walked with her to the base of the platform, squeezed her hand once, and then stepped back, joining the audience. He was not her protector or her translator today. He was simply a man in the crowd, watching his wife. Ada walked up the 3 steps, her silver ring catching the afternoon sun. She was not alone. Behind her, in a nervous, excited line, were her students. Toby was at the front, his small face serious with the importance of his role. He was flanked by the other children, the silent and the deaf, a small, brave troop, bound by a language that had given them a place in the world. Ada turned to face the town. Every eye was on her. She saw in their faces not pity, not mockery, not even a lingering curiosity. She saw respect. She saw anticipation. She saw a community waiting, willingly, to be told a story. She took a deep breath, letting the feeling of the solid platform beneath her feet ground her. She raised her hands, and the last murmur of conversation died. Her movements were not hesitant. They were as clear and confident as the autumn air. She signed, and this time, the whole town leaned in, trying to understand, not just waiting for a translation. You do not need to be perfect, her hands said, her fingers shaping the words with a teacher's patience. She paused, her gaze sweeping across every face, from the reverend to the weathered rancher in the front row. Then she finished the thought. You only need to be seen. And with that, the performance began. It was not a play. It was, as the town would later describe it, a silent symphony. It began with Toby. He stepped forward, and his small hands began to tell a story. It was the story of a single, tiny seed, cupped in his palms. The other children became the landscape, their arms the waving grass, their bodies the hard, unyielding rocks. Toby's hands showed the seed, alone and afraid in the vast, silent earth. He signed dark, cold, alone. Ada stood behind them, not as a director, but as the conductor, her own hands guiding the emotional tempo, her expressions painting the feeling behind the signs. The story continued, a visual poem of fear, of being buried and forgotten. Then came the storm. The children's movements became frantic, their fingers mimicking the slash of rain, their arms the howl of the wind. They became a maelstrom of fear and chaos, threatening to tear the little seed from its fragile hold. It was a story of resilience, of clinging to life when the world tries to wash you away. In the crowd, a woman who had once laughed cruelly at Ada in the church began to weep, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand, not in pity, but in recognition of her own private storms. Then, after the storm, came the sun. One of the young girls, her face beatific, raised her hands high. Her fingers spread wide like golden rays. Toby's seed, which had been curled in on itself, began to unfurl. His fingers stretched, reaching for the light. His other hand signed water, a gentle, flowing gesture. And the town saw not just the sign, but the memory of the fire, of the water that had saved them. The performance reached its crescendo. Toby's seed was no longer a seed. It was a plant, then a flower, its petals opening wide. His face was a mask of pure, silent joy. The other children, who had been the storm, now became a field of supporting flowers, their hands opening in unison, a garden blooming in the silence. It was a story of love, of community, of finding the strength to grow not in spite of the silence, but because of it. A grizzled, rough-looking farmer in the front row, a man who had never been inside the church and who spoke in grunts more than words, watched, his mouth slightly agape. One of the children made a sign, a closed fist held over the heart, a gesture of courage and strength. The farmer, without thinking, slowly raised his own gnarled, work-worn hand and placed it over his own heart, a silent echo of understanding passing between him and the child. At that moment, on the far edge of the celebration, a small commotion occurred. A single rider, a deputy, was leading a second horse. On that horse sat Merritt Cole. He was not in irons, but his posture was that of a prisoner. He was being led out of town, on his way to the territorial prison. He paused, his gaze drawn to the performance, to the silent, powerful story unfolding on the stage. He saw Ada, not as the broken doll he had tried to humiliate, but as the conductor of this strange, beautiful music. He saw the town, not as his audience, but as her congregation. There was no arrogance left in him, no sneer on his lips. There was only a hollow, weary emptiness. He lowered his head, a final, public, and utterly silent admission of his defeat, and the deputy led him away, a ghost fading from a world that no longer had a place for him. On the stage, Ada stepped forward for the final verse. She moved in front of her students, her face serene, her hands moving with a grace that was both powerful and gentle. Even if the world does not listen, she signed, her eyes finding Jonah in the crowd. I will still speak. She paused, and a radiant smile illuminated her face. And I am loved. The final sign hung in the air for a beat, and then the town erupted. It was not polite applause. It was a roar, a thunderous, sustained explosion of clapping, stomping, and whistling. Ada did not hear a single note of it, but she felt it. She felt it as a deep, powerful vibration that surged up from the ground, through the wooden platform, and into the soles of her feet. It was a wave of sound, a physical force that vibrated through her entire body. It was an embrace. It was the sound of 1,000 hearts beating in unison. She closed her eyes, not overwhelmed, but filled by it. A different kind of music, one she could finally feel. When she opened her eyes, Jonah was walking toward the stage. The crowd parted for him. He climbed the steps, and the applause slowly subsided. He did not speak. He did not sign. He simply walked to her, wrapped his arms around her, and pulled her into a fierce, tender embrace. He rested his forehead against hers, just as he had on that first, transformative night by the firelight. It was a private, perfect circle in the center of their new world. After a long moment, he stepped back, but kept one arm around her. With his free hand, he reached into his coat and pulled out the worn leather ledger, the book that had become the chronicle of their life. He opened it to the last, empty page. With a piece of charcoal he carried, he wrote a final, steady line. He held the book open for her to see. The handwriting was strong, clear, and filled with a love that was as solid as the mountains. She was born without sound, but she taught a whole town how to listen. Ada read the words, and her smile was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. She took his large, calloused hand, the one that had held the pen, and lifted it. She did not sign a reply. She did not need to. She placed his hand flat against her chest, directly over her own heart. He felt it there. Beneath his palm, the strong, steady, unwavering beat. It was her answer. It was her signature. It was the rhythm of their life, a final, perfect note. Above them, against a sky that was deepening into the bruised purple of twilight, a long, wavering V of sandhill cranes flew south, their distant, rattling calls a faint, final benediction. A collective sigh seemed to pass through the crowd, through the entire valley. Thistle Ridge was at peace. The story of Ada and Jonah Pike did not end, but it closed like a piece of music that has reached its final perfect chord. There was no final rest, no abrupt stop, because for them, and for the town that had learned to see, the silence itself was the last, most beautiful note of the song. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the wild heart of the West. Where in the world are you listening from? Let us know in the comments below. Share your thoughts, and connect with fellow fans. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Wild West Stories, 1850. Give this video a like, and hit that hype button to help us share these tales with more people who appreciate them. Your support keeps these stories alive.